Welcome to the True Detectives podcast, the show where we dig into the most unbelievable true crime stories.
Wild ride.
Yeah, a wild ride through these real cases with detectives and strange investigations and twists you won't see coming.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about a case today that I think will have you on the edge of your seat. It involves a serial killer nicknamed the Crimson Scribe, a detective haunted by his past, and a bunch of blood-written clues.
Oh, yeah.
Buckle up, folks. And if you're liking the investigation so far, give us a rating and follow the show.
Yeah, please do.
So I'm Adrian Smith.
I'm Dr. Julia Jones. I'm a criminal psychologist.
Alrighty, Dr. Jones. So get this. The Crimson Scribe's fourth victim is found dead, but not just dead, with a message written in their own blood.
Wow.
It's not just any message, though. It's a super complicated pattern of swirling lines and loops.
Oh, my goodness.
What kind of killer would use such a personalized and mysterious way of communicating? I mean, what's the psychology behind that?
Yeah. Well, it's really chilling because this is not just about, scaring people. This is about having power over them and the killer wanting to have this weird conversation with the police, especially with Detective Alex Shaw, who's running the whole investigation.
Right.
And when they use the victim's own blood, it makes it even more scary. It's personal and violating. It feels like they need to be in control almost, like they think they're some kind of artist putting on a really creepy show.
That's an interesting way to think about it, and here's where the story gets even darker. Detective Shaw has a connection to the Crimson Scribe's work. It turns out 5 years ago, his wife was murdered, and her killer was never found.
Oh, no.
And guess what? The crime scene had a similar symbol on it.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, kind of like the ones of the Crimson Scribe's crime scenes.
Wow, that changes everything.
It does.
Detective Shaw isn't just dealing with a tough case. He's also facing his own personal trauma. This could make him focus too much on certain things and miss important details or misunderstand the evidence.
Oh, yeah, like tunnel vision.
Exactly, tunnel vision.
And that's what makes this case so hard to solve. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses.
Yeah.
Just these bloody messages.
Right.
The pressure on Detective Shaw was huge. He had to catch the killer, but also maybe find some peace about what happened to his wife.
Of course. It's a lot for one person to handle.
Yeah. This case is already really interesting because there's no physical evidence.
Right.
It makes the investigators rely on how the killer behaves and their psychology.
You have to think like the killer to catch them.
Yeah. It's like trying to catch a shadow. You have to figure out what they'll do next based on their personality.
Exactly.
So it's a high-stakes game of wits. But in all this mess, Shaw made a discovery. He realized the murders weren't random. They formed a pattern.
Yeah.
It was leading him somewhere.
Interesting.
And that place was somewhere important to him, the abandoned observatory on the hill.
Wait a minute. Wasn't that his wife's favorite spot?
You got it. The place where she loved to look at the stars.
Uh-huh.
The Crimson Scribe knew about Shaw's past, and they were using it against him in a really messed up way.
Wow, this killer is really trying to get inside Detective Shaw's head. It seems like more than just a cat and mouse game.
For sure. What do you think the killer was hoping to achieve by bringing Shaw to the observatory?
It's like they wanted to make Shaw relive his worst moment, not being able to save his wife. But this time there was a new victim, Allison, a young reporter covering the case.
And they were upping the stakes, making it even more personal.
That's so manipulative. They're using Shaw's guilt and his need to solve this case, not just for the city, but for himself.
Right, and by involving Allison, they weren't just making things more violent. They were really messing with Shaw's head.
Tenfold.
And then a hit. The markings on Allison weren't random. They were star charts.
Star charts.
And remember, they were at the observatory, the perfect place to figure out those celestial clues.
Oh, that adds a whole new layer to this. It means the killer knows about stars, maybe astrology or astronomy.
Yeah.
But why use star charts? What were they trying to say with this complicated symbolic language?
That's the question. And while Shaw was figuring out these charts, he saw something else. A flash of light on a nearby rooftop.
What?
He wasn't alone. The killer was watching him.
The killer was enjoying this whole thing. It's like they wanted to be caught, but only after they had completely broken down. Shaw forcing him to play by their rules.
Right.
That's a really twisted kind of mind game.
It was terrifying for Shaw, and it sent him on a chase through the city, following clues that led underground into the city's dark underbelly.
The killer was taking him deeper and deeper into their world, their territory.
Yeah, and underground the rules are different. Reality gets distorted.
It does.
And that distortion led to a final showdown in a huge underground chamber. It was dimly lit with walls covered in those same weird symbols.
Wow.
And there in the middle stood the killer drawing something on the floor with blood.
This is it. The climax of this twisted game. The killers finishing their ritual. What happened next?
While Shaw was ready to end it, he had his gun out and years of pain and anger were driving him. But then he saw it, a symbol on the floor, a symbol that matched a scar on his own chest from childhood.
What?
The killer turned around. His face was hidden behind a mask, but his eyes had this creepy familiarity to them.
Oh my God.
He said, "Recognize it, detective. The scar you have is a mark of fate. You were meant for this fated to play this game." And then he lunged.
A matching scar? What does that even mean? Don't leave us hanging.
We're going to have to pause our investigation here for now, but trust me, the truth about who the Crimson Scribe is and their twisted connection to Detective Shaw is more shocking than you can imagine. Until next time, try to put the clues together. Why the matching scar? What game was the killer talking about? Let us know your theories, and we'll be back soon with a thrilling ending to this case. Welcome back to the True Detectives podcast. We left off with Detective Shaw facing that masked figure in the underground chamber, someone with a matching scar just like the one from Shaw's childhood. And then the killer lunged and a shot rang out.
Man, that cliffhanger really got me. What happened in all that chaos?
You could picture it. Police sirens getting closer. Flashlights cutting through the dark, officers all over the chamber.
Right.
And there in the middle of it all lay the killer, not moving.
It's over. The Crimson Scribe's reign of terror is finally finished.
Yeah.
But who fired the shot and who was behind that mask?
Well, when they took the mask off, the answer shocked everyone. It was Detective Shaw's twin brother.
His twin brother. You're kidding me? All this time Shaw was chasing his own blood relative. This case just got a whole lot weirder. We talk about nature versus nurture, but this is like a real-life example playing out in the worst way possible.
Yeah, it's crazy. No one, not even Shaw, knew he had a twin. They were separated at birth and lived completely separate lives. Talk about a family reunion you never expected.
It's unbelievable. This case is already a deep dive into symbolism and manipulation, but now we're adding in twin separation, maybe shared trauma, and this idea of a doppelganger acting out their dark side.
And that matching scar wasn't just a coincidence. It was a symbol of their shared past, a past neither of them even knew about.
Can you imagine working on this horrible case and suddenly you find out the killer is your twin, someone with your DNA, and maybe even some of the same early experiences? That connection mixed with the betrayal and violence, it must be earth-shattering.
The investigators had a big question to answer. How could two people with the same genes end up so different? One becomes a detective fighting crime and the other embraces the darkness.
Twin studies are fascinating because they show us how much of who we are comes from our genes and how much comes from our environment. This case is even more complicated because they were separated at birth, not having that early bond. The shared experiences that shape us could have really affected them psychologically.
The investigation showed that Detective Shaw's brother had a tough life moving from one foster home to another, never having that stability that many of us take for granted.
We know that childhood experiences, especially trauma, and not having stable relationships can have a huge impact on the developing brain. It can make it hard to form healthy relationships, control your emotions, and deal with stress. Imagine carrying the weight of that unknown past, never knowing the answers to those basic questions about who you are.
And while there were signs of anger issues and an interest in the occult, there was nothing to suggest he'd become a serial killer.
It reminds us that there's no single reason why someone becomes a criminal. It's usually a combination of things: genes, early experiences, social influences, even random events. We can sometimes see warning signs, but we can't predict exactly what someone will do.
But the investigators weren't just focused on his past. They were trying to figure out why he committed the murders, what those cryptic messages meant. What was he trying to accomplish by targeting his own brother?
That's the big question. Was it revenge? Did he want to punish his brother for having the life he never had? Or was it something even darker, maybe a need to connect with the brother he never knew?
His actions definitely show resentment towards his brother's seemingly perfect life. A wife, a good job. It's like a dark version of the evil twin idea.
And those blood-written messages were his way of communicating with his brother, pulling him into his world, making him play his game. It's a horrifying, extreme version of sibling rivalry.
He was messing with his brother's mind, making him relive his failure to save his wife by putting another innocent life, the reporter Allison, in danger.
This case is so psychologically complex. There are elements of typical serial killer behavior, the need for control, the manipulation, the enjoyment of hurting others. But there's also this underlying feeling of longing, a desperate attempt to connect with his brother, even though it's in this awful way.
It's a weird mix of darkness and longing, a desire to hurt and connect with the brother he never knew. But what about Detective Shaw after all this? How do you even begin to cope with the fact that your twin brother is a serial killer responsible for so much pain?
That's a tough question. There's no easy answer. Dealing with that kind of trauma takes a lot of time and effort. But this case also shows how strong the human spirit can be. Even with all the pain and loss, Detective Shaw eventually found a way to move on.
Welcome back to the True Detectives podcast. We're looking at the final chapter in the Crimson Scribe case. Remember, it all started with those mysterious blood-written messages, and then we discovered the killer was Detective Shaw's twin brother, someone he never even knew existed.
It really shows you how unpredictable and complicated people can be. Two individuals with the same DNA ending up on completely opposite sides of the law. It makes you wonder about good and evil and what makes us who we are.
Detective Shaw was haunted by that question. He had always tried to solve crimes and bring justice, and now the person responsible for all this pain was his own flesh and blood. How do you even begin to deal with that kind of revelation?
It must be absolutely devastating on so many levels. There's the shock of finding out you have a twin you never knew, coupled with the horror of their crimes. And then there's the guilt, that question of, could I have done something to stop this? It could lead to a serious identity crisis.
And to make matters worse, the media went crazy with the story. Detective Shaw was suddenly in the spotlight, facing all this scrutiny and speculation.
The media loves to focus on the sensational parts of a case, and they often forget about the real people involved who are going through unimaginable trauma.
It was a rough time for Shaw. He withdrew from the public eye, took a break from the police force, and basically disappeared.
It's completely understandable that he needed time to process everything. This wasn't just a case for him. It was a deeply personal tragedy that turned his world upside down.
While Shaw was trying to cope, investigators were still trying to understand the killer's life, what led him down this dark path. They found out that he had a childhood full of loss and instability, constantly moving from one foster home to another.
That kind of instability early on can really affect a person's development. It can mess up their ability to form attachments, make them distrustful of the world, and make it hard to build healthy relationships. It's not an excuse for committing crimes, but it helps explain things.
They also discovered that he had a growing fascination with the occult, with ancient rituals and symbols. It seemed like he was searching for something, maybe a way to understand his chaotic life, or even a sense of power and control.
That's something we often see in cases of extreme behavior. When people feel lost and powerless, they might look for meaning and control in unusual or even harmful ways.
But his search for meaning twisted into an obsession with his brother, the twin he never knew. He saw in Shaw everything he had been denied: a loving family, a stable life, a respected job.
That whole evil twin idea might be a cliche, but this case shows how that kind of psychological dynamic can happen in real life. It's not just about jealousy, it's about feeling like fate dealt you a bad hand and robbed you of the life you think you deserved.
And that feeling fueled his twisted game, his need to punish his brother just for being alive. He targeted Shaw's wife not simply out of cruelty, but to destroy something precious to Shaw, something at the core of his being.
It was a deliberate act of destruction, a way to inflict the same pain and loss that he felt he had suffered. The blood-written messages, the mysterious symbols, it was all part of his plan to manipulate and torment his brother.
So what happened to Detective Shaw after all of this? How do you move on from such a terrible betrayal, knowing that the person responsible for so much suffering shares your DNA?
There's no simple answer. Healing from that kind of trauma is a long and difficult process. But this case also shows us the strength of the human spirit. Despite the pain and loss, Detective Shaw eventually found a way to keep going.
He used his grief to help others, working with victims of violent crimes, sharing his story, to remind people that even in the darkest times, hope remains.
It's a powerful example of how people can find meaning, even in the face of unbelievable tragedy. Detective Shaw could have easily given in to the darkness, but he chose to use his experience to help others.
It reminds us that while we can't always control what happens to us, we can choose how we respond.
And this case, with all its twists and turns, reminds us that understanding why people behave the way they do, what shapes them, is essential not just for solving crimes, but for preventing them.
This has been a journey into the mind of a killer, the effects of trauma, and the lasting power of hope. We hope this investigation into the Crimson Scribe case has given you a lot to think about.
And remember, everyone behind every headline, every true crime story, there are real people whose lives have been changed forever.
Thank you for joining us on the True Detectives podcast. We'll be back soon with another captivating true crime story. Until then, stay curious and stay safe.